For 25 years, the police had everything about Lisa Ziegert's killer except the one thing that mattered. They had his DNA. They had it from the very beginning, taken from the scene of the crime. A complete, single-source genetic profile of the man who murdered her. And they had no idea who he was. The reason is the same wall that stops so many of these cases. A DNA profile is only useful if you have someone to compare it to. You need a suspect to test, or you need the killer's DNA already sitting in a criminal database. Lisa's killer had never been arrested for anything that would put him in that system, so his genetic fingerprint sat in an evidence file for a quarter of a century, matching no one. But here is what makes this case different from every other cold case on this channel. The killer wasn't invisible to the investigation. Police had actually looked at him. He had been a suspect since the year after the murder. They had interviewed him. They had asked him more than once for a DNA sample, and every single time, for 25 years, he politely refused. He knew that the sample was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell, and he simply would not give it. So the police were stuck in an impossible position. They had the killer's DNA. They had, somewhere on a list of more than 300 people, the killer's name, and they had no legal way to force the man they suspected to prove it was him. Then investigators tried something that did not exist in 1992. They took the killer's DNA, the same sample that had sat useless for decades, and they used it to build a picture of his face, not from a witness, not from a sketch artist, from the genetic code itself. The DNA told them his skin tone, his eye color, his hair color, his ancestry, the likely shape of his face. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly what we do here. That predicted face did something no detective had managed in 25 years. It let investigators look at their giant list of suspects and pull out the handful of men who matched it, and who had refused to give their DNA. There were 11 of them. And when the police finally got the legal power to take those samples by force, and came knocking on the door of one of those 11 men, he sat down, picked up a pen, and wrote out a confession before they could even test him. This is the story of Lisa Ziegert, a beloved young teacher, a town that refused to forget her, and the science that drew a killer's face out of nothing but the code he left behind. Lisa Marie Ziegert was 24 years old, and she was exactly the kind of person a small town builds itself around. She had grown up in Agawam, Massachusetts, a small town near the western Connecticut border, the kind of place that, in 1989, had actually voted overwhelmingly to stay a town rather than become a city. The people who lived there liked it that way, a place where neighbors are friends and friends are family. Lisa was one of its most beloved residents. Her mother, Dee, described her as a special person, bubbly, outgoing, full of fun. She had a gift with children. She treated them like people, took them seriously, and they knew that she genuinely liked them. That gift had become her calling. Lisa had recently graduated from Westfield State College and was working as a teacher's aide at Agawam Middle School. But a starting educator's pay being what it is, she worked a second job in the evenings, a part-time position at a small local card and gift shop called Brittany's, right there in Agawam. It was an ordinary arrangement for a young woman just starting out, the day job she loved and the evening job that helped pay the bills. To this day, at Agawam Middle School, there is a memorial to Lisa under a dogwood tree in the courtyard, a permanent marker of what the town lost. Because her death did not just take a life, it changed Agawam forever. It took the sense of safety out of a place that had chosen, on purpose, to stay small and close and trusting. That is who Lisa Ziegert was before the evening of April 15, 1992. A 24-year-old teacher who was good with kids, loved by a whole town, working a quiet second shift at a card shop to make ends meet. That is the person at the center of this story, not the evidence, not the DNA, not the science. A young woman who should have had 50 more years and got 24. On the evening of April 15, 1992, Lisa was working the closing shift alone at Brittany's card and gift shop. It was a quiet, ordinary night, the kind of shift she'd worked many times. Sometime between roughly 8:30 and 8:50 that night, in the middle of her shift, Lisa disappeared. No one saw it happen, But the scene the next morning told part of the story. When the store's day clerk, a woman named Sophia Maynard, arrived to open up on the morning of April 16th, something was immediately, deeply wrong. The store was unlocked. The lights were on. The background music was still playing. Lisa's car was parked out front, exactly where it had been the night before. Her coat and her purse were still inside, behind the counter. The money in the register was untouched, and so were Lisa's personal belongings. Her school materials, everything. Nothing had been stolen. But one of the back rooms had been trashed. There had been a struggle, and Lisa herself was gone. Sophia Maynard's instincts were immediate and correct. She knew something terrible had happened, and she ran to call the police. Investigators would later piece together that an assault had taken place inside the store to gain control over Lisa, and that the attacker had likely taken her out a side door that led to an alley and driven away. For 4 agonizing days, Lisa was missing, and the town of Agawam searched and prayed. Then, on April 19th, Easter Sunday, a person out walking their dog in a wooded area off Suffield Street, roughly 4 miles from the card shop, found her. Lisa had been sexually assaulted and murdered. She had deep defensive wounds on her hands, the sign of someone who had fought hard for her life before she died. The medical examiner determined she had been killed by multiple stab wounds. Retired Detective Wayne Macy, who worked the case at the time, made the grim trip to notify Lisa's family. Her mother, Dee, remembered dropping to her knees. It was, she said, something she really didn't expect to hear. The killer, though, had left something behind on Lisa's body. Investigators recovered a single-source male DNA profile, the complete genetic signature of one man. In 1992, that was both a breakthrough and a dead end. They had his DNA. They had absolutely no way, yet, to turn it into a name. The investigation into Lisa Zieggert's murder was not a case anyone gave up on. For a quarter of a century, it was actively worked by the Agawam Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, the Hamden District Attorney's Office, and the FBI. This was not a file left in a box. It was a wound the entire region kept trying to close. Over those 25 years, investigators developed an enormous pool of potential suspects, a list that eventually grew to more than 300 people. Every one of them had to be considered, looked at, in many cases interviewed, and the tool that could definitively clear or convict any of them was the DNA. Compare a suspect's sample to the profile from Lisa's body, and you would know. A match meant the killer. No match meant innocence. So investigators worked their way through that list, asking people for DNA samples. Most people gave them. An innocent person, asked to help solve the murder of a beloved local young woman, generally wants to clear their name and help. Sample after sample was tested against the profile, and one after another, they came back as no match. The problem was the small number of people who said no. Because here is the quiet logic that would eventually crack this case. If you're innocent, giving a DNA sample costs you nothing and helps catch a killer. But if you are the killer, that sample is the one piece of evidence that guarantees your conviction. The people who refused to be tested weren't necessarily guilty. Plenty of people refuse for reasons of privacy or principle. But the killer was almost certainly hiding somewhere inside that group of refusers. And one name kept surfacing in the investigation, going all the way back to the year after the murder. A man who had been pointed to by someone who knew him intimately. A man who had been interviewed by police more than once. A man who was always polite, always cooperative in conversation, and who always, without exception, refused to give his DNA. His name was Gary Shara. Gary Shara had been on the investigation's radar almost from the beginning, and the reason came from the person who had known him best. In March of 1993, less than a year after Lisa's murder, Shara's estranged wife, Joyce, gave his name to detectives. She had come to suspect her own husband. According to her attorney, Kevin Healy, she had noticed things she couldn't unsee. Anytime news about the Ziggurt murder came on television, Gary would be glued to it. He needed to know every detail, every development, every step of the investigation, every update on the hunt for the killer. It was, in her account, an obsession. And there was more. Joyce told investigators that on the night Lisa disappeared, Gary had been unaccounted for. He had come home late, and when he came home he had scratches, cuts on his hands, that he never explained. Given that Lisa died with defensive wounds on her own hands, the detail of a suspect coming home the same night with unexplained cuts is the kind of thing that makes an investigator's blood run cold. But it wasn't proof. Gary's attorney had a ready counter. Joyce and Gary were in the middle of a bitter divorce and custody battle over their young son, and the defense argued that her accusation was simply a weapon in that fight, an unstable ex-wife trying to gain leverage. It's a real possibility that a responsible investigation has to weigh, and it muddied the water enough that suspicion alone couldn't move things forward. So it came down, as it always did, to the DNA, and Gary Shara refused to give it. Over the years, he was interviewed repeatedly. He was polite. He answered questions. He had no criminal record. He presented as an ordinary man, married with a young son at the time of the murder. And when asked for a DNA sample, he declined, citing of all things, a fear of cloning. He said he was worried about what might be done with his genetic material. For years, that was the end of the road. A suspect with a motive-shaped shadow around him, an alibi gap, unexplained injuries the night of the murder, and an absolute refusal to provide the one thing that could settle it. The police could not force him, and so Gary Shara stayed exactly where he was, a name on a list, protected by the one word he never stopped saying: number. Until the science found a way around number. To understand what broke this case open, you have to understand a technology that sounds like science fiction and is completely real. It's called DNA phenotyping. Most people know DNA can identify you if your profile is already on file somewhere. But your DNA contains far more than an identifier. It contains the instructions for building you, including many of the physical traits that make up your appearance. Your eye color, your natural hair color, your skin tone, aspects of your facial structure, your biogeographic ancestry, where in the world your family comes from. All of that is written into the genetic code. DNA phenotyping is the process of reading those trait-related markers from a DNA sample and using them to predict what a person looks like, even if you have no idea who they are, and even if they're not in any database. It doesn't find a name, it builds a description. A portrait drawn not by a witness who glimpsed a face, but by the biology of the person themselves. In December of 2015, investigators sent the DNA from Lisa Ziegert's case to Parabon Nanolabs, a company at the forefront of this technology, running a service called Snapshot. Parabon analyzed the killer's genetic material and produced a prediction. Lisa's killer, the DNA said, was a man of European ancestry, fair-skinned, with brown or hazel eyes and brown or black hair. They generated a composite image of what he likely looked like, and, because 25 years had passed, they also produced an age-progressed version, showing how that same face would probably look by the time the man reached around 50. For the first time in a quarter of a century, the investigation had a face to point at, not a certain one. Phenotyping predicts likelihoods, not guarantees, and investigators were careful about that. It couldn't tell them a name. It couldn't, on its own, convict anyone, but it could do something almost as powerful. It could take a list of more than 300 suspects and let detectives ask a brand new question. Which of these men actually matches the face the DNA drew? And when you combine that filter, men who fit the genetic description, with the group that had always been the most suspicious anyway, men who had refused to give their DNA, the enormous list collapsed, down from hundreds to a small, sharp handful. 11 men. 11 suspects who fit the phenotype and who had refused, over the years, to be tested. And in August of 2017, investigators went to a grand jury and asked for the power they had never had before, the legal authority to compel those 11 men to give up their DNA, whether they wanted to or not. The grand jury granted it. After 25 years, the word no was about to stop working. With court orders in hand, investigators began the process of collecting DNA from the 11 men on the list. They went, one by one, to serve legal notice, the paperwork that meant a suspect could no longer refuse. Gary Shara was one of the 11. On the evening of September 13, 2017, a Massachusetts State Police trooper named Noah Pack went to Shara's home in West Springfield to notify him about the process. Shara wasn't there. So the trooper did the ordinary thing. He left a message with someone at the residence, letting Gary know that the police had important paperwork to deliver and asking him to make contact. That message was the trigger, because Gary Shara understood exactly what that paperwork was. He had spent 25 years refusing to give his DNA, knowing precisely why, and now the police were at his door, with legal authority he could not refuse. He knew what the sample would prove. He knew, as he would later write in his own hand, that it would send him away for life. The next evening, September 14th, something unexpected happened at the State Police Barracks in Westfield. Gary Shara's girlfriend walked in, unannounced. She was carrying documents, handwritten notes that Gary had left for her at her house that morning, after she'd gone to work. She had read them, and whatever was in them had frightened her enough to bring them straight to the police. The notes were 4 pages, in Gary's handwriting, forming 3 separate documents. The first was addressed to his girlfriend, signed with a single large letter G, and in it, Gary Shara confessed. He wrote that he had abducted, raped, and murdered a young woman 25 years ago. He wrote that he'd gotten word the state police had come to his home with paperwork. He knew it was a warrant for his DNA. He knew it would send him away for the rest of his life. There was another document too, this one addressed to the Ziggurt family. In it, Shara wrote that he could never apologize enough for taking their daughter and their sister. He said he regretted it, that he hated himself for killing Lisa, and that he was sorry. He signed that one with his initials. The man who had said no for 25 years had, in the space of a single message left with a roommate, finally understood that no had stopped working. And rather than face the sample, he confessed. Confessing was one thing. Facing what came next was another, and Gary Shara ran. After leaving the notes, he fled. Investigators launched a search, and on the night of September 14th, his car was found in the parking lot of Johnson Memorial Hospital in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. On the dashboard, visible through the windshield, was another folded, handwritten note, a suicide note. In it, Shara apologized to whoever would find his body for any psychological trauma it caused them. But Gary Shara was not dead. Apparently having second thoughts, he had walked into the hospital's emergency room, checking himself in for treatment after taking an overdose of over-the-counter pills. He survived, and now the police had him. On September 15th, an arrest warrant was issued from the Westfield District Court, charging Gary Shara with the murder, aggravated rape, and kidnapping of Lisa Ziegert. Investigators executed search warrants at his home and his girlfriend's home, seizing items likely to carry his biological material, including a toothbrush. That toothbrush was sent to the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, and on Saturday, September 16, 2017, the lab delivered the result that 25 years had been building toward. The DNA extracted from Gary Shara's toothbrush matched the unknown single-source male profile taken from the evidence in Lisa Ziegurt's case. It was a match, complete and conclusive. The DNA that Gary Shara had spent a quarter of a century refusing to hand over, the sample he was so certain would end him that he'd tried to end himself rather than give it, had finally been taken from a toothbrush in his own bathroom, and it said exactly what he had always known it would say. He was the man who killed Lisa Ziegert. The confession told them. The DNA proved it. After 25 years, both halves of the answer finally sat on the same table. For all the certainty of the DNA and the confession, the legal road still took 2 more years. In December of 2017, a Hampton Superior Court grand jury indicted Gary Shara on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. 2 of those charges, the kidnapping and the rape, would later have to be dropped, not because there was any doubt he'd committed them, but because of the statute of limitations. So much time had passed since 1992 that the law's own clock had run out on those specific counts. It's a bitter technicality. The delay that the killer's silence had bought him meant that, on paper, he could only be held fully accountable for the murder itself. But the murder charge was more than enough. First-degree murder in Massachusetts carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At first, despite the handwritten confession and the matching DNA, Gary Shara pleaded not guilty. For a time, it looked like there might be a trial, a prospect that would have forced Lisa's family to sit through the details all over again. But in September of 2019, 27 years after Lisa's murder, Shara changed his plea. He stood in Hampton County Superior Court and pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Lisa Ziegert. He was sentenced that day to life in prison without parole. His own confession letters, which came to light through the case, revealed the darkness underneath the polite, ordinary man the community had known. In them, Shara wrote that he had been fascinated by abduction and bondage from an early age. It was the kind of admission that reframed everything: the polite interviews, the refusals, the 25 years of a normal-looking life. Underneath all of it had been the man who wrote those words. District Attorney Anthony Gallooni, who had led the case, spoke about the family after the plea. He said that Lisa would never return to her loving family. That remained tragically true, but that the search for justice had ended with the beginning of Gary Shara's life sentence. He credited the Ziggurt family's unbroken faith, strength, and grace over so many years, and the investigators and members of the public who never forgot Lisa and never stopped believing that justice would someday come. It's worth being precise about what actually solved this case, because it's a lesson with reach far beyond Agawam. The DNA phenotyping did not, by itself, name Gary Shara. That's an important distinction. The predicted face didn't walk into a courtroom and identify him. What it did was change the shape of the investigation. For 25 years, detectives had been staring at a list of more than 300 names with no way to prioritize. Phenotyping gave them a lens. It let them filter that list down to the men who genuinely matched the killer's genetic description. And when they overlaid that with the men who had refused DNA testing, the case narrowed from an ocean to a puddle. 11 names. That narrowing is what gave investigators the confidence and the grounds to go to a grand jury and compel those specific men. And it was that compulsion, the end of the ability to refuse, that broke Gary Shara. He didn't confess because the phenotype identified him. He confessed because the science had finally maneuvered the investigation into a position where his DNA could be taken by force, and he knew what it would prove. So the real machinery of this solve was a chain. The DNA drew a face. The face narrowed the list. The narrowed list justified the court orders. The court orders removed the killer's ability to say no, and the removal of no produced a confession before a single new sample was even tested. That's why this case became a landmark for DNA phenotyping. It showed that even when the technology can't hand you a name, it can do something nearly as valuable. It can take an impossible, sprawling suspect list and shrink it to something a team of detectives can actually act on. For the thousands of cold cases sitting in evidence rooms with a killer's DNA but no database match, that's an enormous shift. You no longer necessarily need the killer to already be in the system. You can start from the DNA itself and work toward the face, the ancestry, the short list. The evidence, once again, was always there. Gary Shara's DNA had been in police hands since 1992. What changed wasn't the evidence. It was the science's ability to make that evidence speak, first by drawing a face, and finally, by taking away a killer's last defense, the word no. Strip away the forensic breakthrough, and what endures about Lisa Ziegert's case is the town that would not let her go. 25 years is long enough for most communities to move on, for a name to fade into local history, for a case to become a thing older residents vaguely remember. That did not happen in Agawam. The memorial under the dogwood tree stayed. The investigators kept working. And crucially, the public never stopped caring. The district attorney specifically thanked the members of the public who never forgot Lisa and who believed justice would someday come. That collective refusal to forget is not a sentimental footnote. It's part of the machinery. Cases stay funded, stay staffed, and stay alive when a community keeps them alive. And at the center of that endurance was Lisa's family, her mother Dee, and the others who carried this for 27 years. The district attorney singled out their unbroken faith, strength, and grace, and said it had inspired everyone around them to keep searching for the truth. There is a version of grief that curdles into bitterness and gives up, and there is a version that becomes a kind of fuel that keeps showing up, keeps believing, keeps a candle in the window for decades. Lisa's family chose the second kind. It could not bring her back, but it helped make sure that the man who took her did not get to keep living quietly under the polite mask he'd worn for 25 years. There's a harder truth in this case too, and it's worth naming. Gary Shara nearly got away with it, not by being clever or invisible, but simply by saying no. For a quarter of a century, an ordinary word held off justice. He wasn't hiding in another country. He was right there, interviewed, suspected, living his life a few towns over, protected by nothing but his refusal. That should be sobering, and it's exactly why the science that finally cornered him matters so much. It closed the one loophole that had let a confessed killer live free for 25 years. The loophole of simply declining to be tested. Lisa Ziegert was 24. She was good with children, loved by a whole town, working a second job to make her way in the world. She fought for her life, and in the end, after 27 years, the town that never forgot her got to hear the word that had eluded it for so long: guilty. If there's a lesson in Lisa Ziegert's case, it's that the answer can be sitting in plain sight, protected by nothing more than a suspect's right to say no, until the science finds a way to make that no irrelevant. For 25 years, Gary Shara was not lost. He was found over and over. He was interviewed, suspected, named by the person closest to him, flagged by his own behavior on the night of the murder. The only thing standing between him and a conviction was a cheek swab he wouldn't give. And for a quarter of a century, that was enough. The system could not force it, and he would not offer it. What changed everything was the ability to work from the DNA outward, to build a face from the code, narrow 300 suspects to 11, and give a court the specific, justified grounds to take the sample by force. The moment that became possible, Gary Shara's entire defense collapsed. He had built his freedom on a single word, and the science pulled that word out from under him. He confessed before they even ran the test, because he understood the game was finally over. He thought no would protect him forever. It protected him for 25 years. It did not protect him for 26. Lisa Ziegert was 24 years old, a teacher who was good with kids and loved by a town that voted to stay small so it could stay close. She deserved to grow old there. It took 27 years, a memorial under a dogwood tree, a family that never lost faith, and a technology that could draw a killer's face out of the code he left behind. But Agawam got its answer, and the man who took her will die in prison. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these cases deserve to be told, subscribe. The next one is coming.